There you go. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Henry Lang, as he says, oil and gas sector leader within Golder Associates in the UK. For those of you that don't know Golder, the very short plug is we are about 9,000 people strong, 180 odd offices globally, Canadian in origin, started in the 1960s. We're environmental and geoscience consultants primarily within the oil and gas and mining sectors. And I think at the moment we've got an office in pretty well every primary shale play in the US, and we're active in most global play areas in one way or another. What I'm looking at this morning, and something that we go on to consider in more detail this afternoon in the workshop, is the range of subsurface and environmental risks that unconventionals can generate and how we manage those. And if you think about the primary title of what we're talking about today, it's International Unconventional Oil and Gas. That's more than just shale, as has been mentioned this morning by both Matt and Jay. It's not just shale gas, there are a lot of variations out there. We've got oil shale and shale oil. We've got the oil sands, which Canada is particularly famous for. And we've got methane hydrates, which people have touched on a couple of times very briefly by mention, but I'll try and give a bit more consideration to. But generally speaking, there's nothing unconventional in most of the techniques, and I have to say, as Jay's demonstrated, nothing particularly new here, other than the fact it's potentially new to the media and a lot of other people. I think unconventional gas, most of us are now comfortable with the sorts of definitions of what we're talking about: shale gas, natural gas in shale formations, but it also includes coal bed methane, methane in tight sandstones, and methane hydrates are still an unconventional gas. And we're talking about resource plays in the shale gas sector, and has been touched on and demonstrated by Jay, shales normally have insufficient permeability to allow significant fluid flow to a wellbore, except where we do something to exacerbate that. So we have a low matrix permeability, so gas production in commercial quantities requires us to do something to get it out. But shale gas has been produced for many years from shales, and the boom, as Jay ably demonstrated, is primarily because of the technical advances in hydraulic fracturing and particularly horizontal drilling. But horizontal drilling itself is not new. When you look at the reservoirs, I think most of us in the room are familiar with the difference between a conventional reservoir and the unconventional. But we come back to the issue of low permeability, tight formations, such as tight sands and carbonates. And that primary issue of low permeability, the need to use horizontal drilling, and the need to stimulate fractures by fracking, however we wish to spell fracking, hydraulic fracturing. Shame in a way that as an industry we didn't foresee the ability to hijack a phrase and misuse it, but I suppose we've probably got French Connection UK to blame for that. I think most people have probably seen this diagram before. It gives us a general overview as to what we're dealing with compared to the conventional reservoirs that most of us cut our teeth on in the past, and where we've now gone with the unconventional. What we've got to remember is that as an industry, certainly in the UK, most of us as geologists started working on conventional plays. We've been associated with unconventionals, and taking the point earlier wherever the gentleman was asking about Kimmeridge, I'll touch on that a bit more later, but there's an area that's actually been an important part of the UK's unconventional sector for a long time. global potential of shale, and what I'm looking at here is primarily the shale plays. I think it demonstrates, picking up again on some of the things that Matt identified this morning, resource estimates, and without resource estimates, we still don't know much about what's in China. The eastern side, generally, there's an awful lot still to be learned. Bluntly, we're still very short on information for an awful lot of these areas globally, but IHS are very effective at pulling what information there is out there together, and there's a lot of information, I think, still held in non-shale wells, boreholes that have been carried out for completely different purposes, where the data sets, quite often, particularly when you get into the former Soviet Union areas, you can't get that data set for love nor money in a lot of cases, unless you've discovered an effective means of getting information out of the former Soviet bloc. I think those figures will vary, and I think the sorts of numbers we're looking at here for the estimates, again, as Matt was demonstrating, it depends who's doing the assessment. It depends what parameters you're using in that assessment. It depends what variables you're counting. And there's a material difference between what may be available and, picking up on the question that was asked from the floor earlier, what is actually economic and commercially viable. Never mind shale gas, what about oil shales, known as kerogen shales? So we're looking at organic rich, fine-grained rocks. Again, as was mentioned this morning, shale oil in its own right shouldn't be confused with tight oil. All shale differs from oil sands as well, and I think globally there are resources out there that are still to be identified. Oil sands and tar sands, everybody immediately thinks of Athabasca and the Canadian areas, but there are a lot of other oil sand, I'm not sure if you'd call it a play, but basin or areas out there. As a company, we've already looked and been involved with clients in discussions regarding oil sands in all of the areas along the bottom, Albania, Congo, Madagascar, Mongolia, Nigeria. Whether any of those are remotely commercially viable will depend on prices and all sorts of geopolitics and economics. But I think now the difference in the current market with the sorts of oil price we're playing with and the stability of that oil price, we're seeing things being considered that just weren't worth looking at a few years ago. Because if you look at the general distribution, we've also got some very significant shales sitting in the Middle East. And what surprised me is when you consider that, and I'll be interested to, anybody can heckle me on this one, in an area in the Middle East where we're talking about standard rates of recovery from existing fields of being about 20%, that they're even considering starting to look at the shale plays and the oil shales as potential sources, when you would think actually a bit of investment in enhanced recovery would make far more commercial sense. But that's me, a geologist and environmental scientist, straying into economics, not a good move. And then, as I touched on earlier, as an unconventional source, methane hydrates, I think they've occurred in a couple of fairly lurid novels as a clever way of ending the world if the bad guys succeed. And I know it turns up as an issue in some regions. But what do we know about gas hydrates? Clathrates, a structure where water molecules are bound within water molecules form this cage-like structure that may contain gas, and if that gas happens to be methane, it's a methane hydrate. To the best of our knowledge currently, they're formed at low temperature and high pressure, and as such are generated primarily as seafloor deposits. My understanding at the moment is certainly that they're too dispersed for economic extraction, but that's as I stand here today. I know that there are organisations looking at it out there, considering the viability of it, just as other organisations are looking at the viability of significant deep sea mining. I think the issues facing development are certainly technical challenges, but at the moment, detection of viable reserves is a developing science, and I think we've got a long way to go before significant methane hydrate development is going to be something that we can be talking about. But when you look at the reserves and the potential out there, this is drawn from a paper that was given, I think, a year ago, yet in its own right draws on much earlier data from 2005. At that time, we were identifying gas from hydrates as being a really major potential resource if, and that's a big if, it could be tapped, and if geopolitically again and commercially the will was there to tap it. But I think this is one very much for the future and is probably not going to be a major source, certainly within my working lifetime. But it's again an interesting unconventional potential. Historical context of unconventionals in the UK. Now, I, like the gentleman who sat over there, I'm a Dorset lad. I am aware of records, probably not contemporaneous, but certainly information that's held within Dorset County Museum from archaeological evidence that during the Roman period, they were extracting oil shale from the Kimmeridge area. Sadly, wherever Jay is, I don't have any photographs to demonstrate that. We know, obviously, from the Bings and all the history, there's an awful lot of activity with the Scottish oil shale mining through the Victorian period. What's less well known is in Dorset, there was the Kimmeridge Oil and Shale Company and that one extract company, which in 1848 was supplying and lighting the streets of Wareham down in Dorset with gas derived from the Kimmeridge shale. You beat us. But I think the Romans got there first. So I claim primacy for Dorset on that point. And by 1890, there was a plan to light the streets of Paris with Kimmeridge shale gas. And there's the remains of a pier still sitting off Kimmeridge. So for those of you, how many geologists in the room, stick your hands up. How many of you went on a field trip to Dorset? Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, well, you'll probably recognise Kimmeridge Bay and this Kimmeridge, the cliffs at Kimmeridge, you know, are source rock. That pier was constructed originally using some of the heavy bands for exporting Kimmeridge shale both round to Wareham, where the retorts were by the what's now the railway station. The other nice thing about Kimmeridge is it demonstrates a continuity in the industry. We've still got, yeah, there's the Nodding Donkey, which I think was the oldest operating nodding donkey in the UK. So that, to my mind, and in fact, if you go down there today, and I think, David, we really ought to organise a field trip for next summer. Within the cliffs, there's an exposure which now contains, amongst other things, rail track from the mining shafts sticking out of the cliff. And I'm not sure if it's still there, but for a while, and I think Ian West's website certainly has a photograph that shows a mine truck embedded in the cliff face where the cliff has eroded back to one of the adits. And that dates back for over 100 years. So that mine truck was obviously abandoned in there. But this whole area down in Dorset, if you do the right thing, you can actually set fire to the cliffs here. And certainly back again in Victorian times, further back towards Weymouth, There's an area that is known and even shown on the maps as Burning Cliff, which is another exposure of the shale. It is thought at the time that the source of the fire was seawater breaking up the cliff, causing the pyrite in the cliff to ignite and set fire to the shale. So, active geology in action. But the primary purpose of this is to talk about risk management. I think for all the unconventional resources and regions we're looking at, we need to identify and address the possible risks. We've got a bunch of key issues. We know that wherever we are, we've got to go through operational consents and permits. Water is an issue, either as a sort of, getting enough water to site or the theoretical and potential impacts on water. Surface water impacts, groundwater impacts, the risk of gas or additives or fluid migrating into aquifers tends to be one of the big issues for the objectors. But if you're actually looking at hydrofracking, one of the things we tend to all know now is you've got a high water demand for the process. Air quality comes up. There is a big concern in a lot of areas about gas leaks to atmosphere and emissions generally. But again, just sticking with UK for a second, I could take you to places in the UK where there are natural gas seeps still escaping to surface, but they're in undrillable areas because of the environmental sensitivities. Do we address that? No, we don't. It's too sensitive. We've then got microseismic and tectonics generally. That, of course, hit the news big time with Quadrilla's activities. We then have more social risks, traffic impact, and as I say, a social license to operate. But the social license to operate, in part, depends on how we address the topics above. Shale gas reservoir stimulation, what's involved? Well, we all know about hydraulic fracturing. We need to create additional permeability. It improves gas migration to the bore for production, but as Jay demonstrated, it's a mature technique. How does it work? Well, we're pumping fluids to create fractures or openings for the proppant to flow. And the proppant remains in place, allowing gas and water to flow back to the bore. But if you think about, again, what's been touched on in previous talks so far, each and every play is going to be slightly different. The stresses, the pressures, the issues we're addressing will be different. And why has there been such a fuss? Well, the realities of shale gas development, we've met with significant public and political scrutiny and resistance, not just here in the UK, France, moratorium, other parts of Europe, Ukraine, quite a lot of fuss, but it looks like it'll be moving ahead. Poland, slowly developing, and there's now talk about Lithuania and various other countries. North Africa, it's developing further there, but trying to think of an area with less water is possibly harder. But why has there been such a fuss? Partly because hydraulic stimulation has been difficult to predict. For everything that Jay was demonstrating, as an industry, we've tended to, certainly in the States, get on with it rather than talk about it and explain what we're doing in advance. We know nature is complex and hydraulic fractures interact and can impinge on natural fractures and geology. And again, I think the situation in Blackpool demonstrated that. And bluntly, when it comes to the environment, poorly designed and delivered hydraulic fracturing has the risk of creating pathways for fluid migration. But where it's done properly, I think we've all seen that needn't be an issue, and that's what we're touching on today. And as I say, there's also a lot of public concern relating to seismic activity. So when addressing it, and this is a fairly hard to read slide, But this is a sort of matrix that we're having to think about in terms of the risks and issues that raise their heads when it comes to the development of a new play. We've got, certainly, you know, we've got the reservoir assessment phase, exploration and drilling, which is as far as we've got in the UK at the moment, and there's an awful lot of exploration needed before we can reach the production stage in the UK, because we are still short of an awful lot of information. But if you think of the life cycle of any play, you go production and development, mature development, and then, just as it was for the conventional plays, you're looking at reclamation and abandonment. Now, for the conventional plays in the UK, we've actually had fields onshore that have gone right the way through that. And if you think about some of the fields that have been developed historically in the UK, Ekring area, they've actually gone right the way through that cycle. There have been small gas fields in the UK that have gone right the way through that cycle. But at the moment, when it comes to unconventionals, we're here. We still have an awful lot to learn about what we're trying to achieve and what is doable. The political reality in the UK, the population density, the environmental issues, and generally the social license, is already an issue here when we're trying to gather the data. So we've got an awful lot to do if we really think we're actually going to get to this stage in the UK, shale-wise. But the same applies globally. That process and consideration of what those risks are applies pretty well whether it's a conventional or an unconventional play, but certainly applies whether we're doing it in China, North Africa, Poland, Ukraine, South Africa, particularly if you happen to be in the Karoo, or onshore UK. We've got, running down it, if I can see in my decrepit state, certainly can't see that, regulatory and process compliance, legal risks, land availability, land ownership availability. I have in my bag this month's edition of Southeast Farmer magazine, 3-page article from a lawyer on how to deal with oil companies if they come wanting to drill on your land. Everybody's jumping on the bandwagon at the moment, not surprisingly, including the lawyers. Surface groundwater management, air emissions, wildlife habitat and species, wastewater management, energy supply, engineering design and development. You've got to have your well pads properly designed and located. Certainly with the conventional plays in the UK historically, when they were being drilled a lot in the 80s, well pad location, access, dealing with landowners, these were the issues that had to be dealt with very early on, because one of the things that was noted quite correctly is that an easy line of attack for objectors was to deal with the landowner. The oil company knows what it's doing, knows what it's trying to achieve, but if you could nobble the landowner, you can't do anything, because if the landowner doesn't give consent, no oil company, I would say, in the UK is going to go the compulsory purchase route to try and develop a field. So one of the critical issues is making sure you have your landowner negotiations, landowner rights and issues managed very well. Into that, we now have in the UK the little issue of subsurface trespass, but I'm not going to go into that today. I leave that to the lawyers. You've got to get your waste management issues addressed, stakeholder engagement. That is, of course, the big one from a socio-economic, socio-environmental stakeholder engagement. Health and safety, occupational health, I'll touch on briefly later, is a rising issue with regards to operations in the US, Natural hazards, less of an issue here, but certainly in the States, in the last month or so, Colorado area, we've had a lot of well pads getting flooded out and a number of issues arising from significant flooding of large areas of the plays. That's generated a lot of activity and a lot of business in clearing up the mess that's derived from that. But some of the operators hadn't planned adequately for that fairly unexpected event. And then cumulative effects. If you're looking at a full field development up here, you actually need to be thinking about, are we going to be able to reach field development and the likely cumulative impacts whilst we're really at this stage. However, it only needs to be an overview at that point, because in reality, in a lot of areas, as some of the operators are finding in Poland, it looks promising in concept, but when you actually get in there and start making holes, it just doesn't stack up. So as I say, the risk management and the risks will vary by play. You need to follow a risk assessment process. The shale plays are different, as has been identified very effectively by Jay, in terms of depth, stratigraphy, stress, and that's one of the things that does need to be considered. The resources available, receptors, and obviously the sweet spots. Each potential resource and receptor has to be tested and evaluated. The only way we can do that is by getting those initial holes drilled. And I think that's one of the things that still keeps being missed in the UK, is that I suppose it's not in the media's interest to latch onto it, but all we're trying to do is evaluate these areas. We're not actually at a stage where we're realistically talking about developing them. But one of the things to remember is that there are big differences in tectonic stresses between the USA and European shales. And that impacts on the processes and sensitivities, and certainly impacts on fracking pressures, the pumping pressures you'll have to achieve. As Jay touched on, the actual sort of crackability of the formation, and also the proppants you then use. I am aware of there being a well drilled fairly recently, not in the UK, that has collapsed because the proppants aren't man enough for the job. And I think this is one of the things that people need to be aware of, that your basic information gathering has to be pretty comprehensive for you to be able to design and model the processes you're going to have to adopt. So assumptions are dangerous things. You cannot assume because a particular play in one area is being drilled effectively that it'll work just as well elsewhere. And I think, I see Jay's nodding, I think that's a lesson well learnt in the US, isn't it? So what are the key issues? Well, we know water management, the availability of water, critical component in the supply chain for fracking because it does use significant amounts of water. You need to identify the local limiting factors. As an organisation, we carry out quite a few, should we say, water basin assessments as part of shale play assessment by operators, because never mind the potential of the shale play, if you haven't got enough fluids in the area, it starts to affect the economics. The weakest link in the chain presents the greatest link, and that weak link varies from play to play. We need to assess the risk both of source and supply, but also sensitive receptors. And what we found, and I think certainly is used far more in the US now, is strategic decision-making processes to evaluate what is feasible and economic in terms of water supply, water management options. And you need a detailed water management plan. The water cycle is quite important. You've got to consider your source. Do you need to transport water to it? how do you manage and control that water? Your fracking process, obviously, if you're using hydrofrack, generates significant flowback. You then have to do something with that flowback water, whether it's treatment, disposal, recycling, and reuse. And there's certainly a move and a lot of pressure in the US to minimize water use, optimize reuse, but with that comes a whole bunch of other issues. And then additives. That big, scary chemical cocktail mix that people are supposed to be adding to the water and pumping down a hole. I think the thing that is very clear is that openness is a key to regulator and social acceptance. That's the way it's moving in the States. That's certainly what the EA are looking for in the UK. It's increasingly an issue across Europe. And despite, I know Halliburton always want to keep their mixes secret, but bluntly, that's in the past, that's history. And we also need to be looking at making sure that what chemicals we use not only can be disclosed, but are as, in inverted commas, environmentally friendly as possible. It just makes the whole process of getting our social license to operate, our permits, a lot easier. And there are emerging alternatives. I have to say, from a purely personal point of view, the idea of using gas and propane as your fracking medium scares the hell out of me. Having spent so many years on so many rigs controlling gas, the idea of that just, I find, personally, uncomfortable. But these things are obviously being explored and looked at. Air quality. We've come a long way since 1984, or have we? That was flaring at a conventional field not far from Doncaster. The field went on to supply gas for power generation and a local brickworks. We haven't got any media in the room, have we?
You're on video.
Yeah, true. Okay. That I won't name it, but that field then became an option for carbon capture and storage when it was played out a few years ago, and is now sitting there as a restored field. It was a small one, but the good thing is we've come a long way, as I say. But when you start to look at the flaring activities in a lot of areas, actually things haven't materially changed. What intrigues me is, for an onshore field in the 1980s, Conoco developed a totally enclosed ground flare for the control of light emission, atmospheric emission and noise. We even tested it on one of the North Sea gas field pipelines coming into their terminal on Humberside, I think it was. It's probably still sat up there, sitting in somebody's backyard or in a scrapyard somewhere. What intrigues me is why we're still flaring like this in so many areas. But that's an area I think technology still needs to address in a lot of regions. So what are the issues in air quality? We've got air emission sources that change depending on the stage of development. In the early phases, we've got, even now in the US, drill rigs switching from diesel to gas to minimize their emissions, so gas engines. We've got frac engines, frac operations using a lot of diesel engine pumps and vehicles. But again, I see recent press releases that at least one operator has switched to gas-powered frac generators and pumps. Well testing and completion, venting or flaring of gas. It's an area that I think, as I say, still could do some work. Production, emissions from compressors and pumps, but the key one on the production stage, people tend to worry about are fugitive emissions from pipelines, associated equipment. Generally speaking, we're talking about natural gas leakage. NOxes emitted while burning the fuels in the engines and compressors, VOCs during natural gas dehydration, particulate matters from well pad construction, ozone exceedances, and an increasing issue, again, the other side of the pond, greenhouse gas mandatory reporting. But again, we're starting to see that as a driver in Europe. So I come back to my issue of flaring. We've got to make sure in Europe we're using the right type of flare. There's issues regarding noise, light, odour. Shouldn't be any odour. Monitoring should be carried out. It should be continuous, and we should be validating that monitoring. This is important. We need to be gathering this data. We need to be getting, as an industry, these data sets this side of the pond in the UK and Europe so that we can demonstrate we're not bad neighbours. We need to be carrying out plume modelling. Every other industry that generates significant emissions carries out plume modelling. I think we should be doing it as well. When it comes to fugitive emissions, it's actually often a case of the quality of the valves and making sure that the kit we use and the installation is of the right quality. I think, again, the issue, the other side of the pond tends to be that a lot of these things in certain areas were thrown together on a low-cost base and aren't necessarily maintained as well as they could be because the operating margins are very low. But again, if we're going to do it, we need to do it properly. The emissions during drilling need to be monitored. As I said, occupational health, dusts, silicon sand proppant is an occupational health issue. I'll touch on it more this afternoon, but where silica sand as the primary proppant is 99% silica, they found on a number of well pads the exposure limits for the operators, certainly not off-site, but within the well pad area, whilst the silica sand is being delivered and pumped in, the actual, we're well exceeding acceptable occupational exposure limits for the workers. So again, as with any of these environmental issues, we need a detailed baseline assessment and management plan. Microseismicity, bluntly, hydraulic fracturing generates microseismic events. It's bound to. That is what we're trying to achieve. We're actually opening up fractures within the earth, within the formation. But the majority of these are too small to be detected, except with specialist equipment. We can use that specialist equipment to map the horizontal and vertical extent of the fracture developing during the fracking process. And my data is a bit out of date, but by the end of 2012, as I understand it, there were 3 identified induced seismicity events, 1 in the US, 1 in Canada, and guess what, 1 in the UK. But even those were too small to cause damage, and certainly as somebody who now lives in Kent, we actually get fairly frequent natural seismic events down there that chuck off roof tiles and cause cracks. They don't make the headlines other than the local press. And of all those wells hydraulically fractured in the US, 3 events aren't statistically significant. However, they are from a point of view of media and risk management for us as an industry. And we have to remember that the European shales, come back to the point, very different tectonic history and stress regime to the US. So we must evaluate, model and monitor as part of the exploration program. Otherwise, things like that will happen again. Our recommendation, partly because it's a service we offer, but then that's consultants for you, is the use of some form of discrete fracture network model. Geomechanic, geologic approach that represents the geometry and properties of what's down there. Not just the natural fractures, but the impact of the induced fractures. It takes available data, but again, if we're drilling in new areas, the more data we have, the better it is. It's using proven technology that actually was developed for the nuclear waste sector, because those boys really did want to know what the weaknesses were in the rocks they were drilling into. And it's been around for at least 25 years, and it's a cost-effective approach for improved understanding and the development. So it's effective as a means of optimizing your fracking process, but it's also effective at evaluating what your risks are of, in essence, lubricating significant fractures and possibly even faults in the area that you're operating in. It can be used as a very effective predictive tool as part of your modelling and risk management process. This afternoon, one of my colleagues will run the workflow as to demonstrate what it can achieve. But that, I think, the picture in the middle demonstrates the sort of level of model that we can produce. Not just us, there are others out there, but they won't be named. But it's a very useful tool in managing the subsurface risks. So, is this a new dawn? Well, I'll be interested to see what other people's view is regarding the development of shale in the UK. We know in the US that the regulatory developments are tightening all the time regarding water treatment and reuse. There's a moratorium on fracking in a lot of areas. New York, certain parts, Quebec, Vermont, France, other countries in Europe, I think the jury is still out. There are significant geopolitical drivers in countries like the Ukraine and Poland. They really want to be able to tell Gazprom where to go. So if they can develop a home resource, the driver is really there. They really want to do it. And that's one of the things about this particular industry, is we're playing very much with geopolitics. Several states now require frac fluid chemical disclosure. The EPA are putting out new regulations. There are significant new regulations for fracking on federal land. In Poland, we're operating under the mining regulations, but that's evolving. The EU themselves are looking at developing new rules. And what's interesting is I think we in the UK, with the guidance that's now out there, and certainly some of the publications and the work of the Onshore Operators Group, we actually have an opportunity to demonstrate and set best practice standards for the rest of Europe. And these regulatory and social issues are being addressed by technological developments within the industry. More and more people are using some form of strategic decision-making tools for risk assessment, and the regulators are looking and asking for us to be able to demonstrate that. They're looking for us to be able to demonstrate that the whole life risk has been assessed and a management plan is in place. There are closed-loop fluid handling systems being developed, green completions, and as was touched on earlier, flexible rig design, purpose-built units for multi-well pad use reduces the drilling footprint, so we don't need as many well pads to economically develop a field, so we can do longer laterals, improve production. It's more cost effective, it reduces the infrastructure, it reduces all of the issues. We need to look very carefully at the geomechanics and rock properties. We've got much more multi-component seismic acquisition taking place and microseismic monitoring. But one of the critical issues is a good cement job. If you look at the historic issues, the historic concerns in the state, an awful lot of it relates back to poor cement jobs. And that is one of the critical elements. We've got to get the boreholes installed correctly, cemented, got to get the liners in, do it properly, and then run the logs to demonstrate that we have done it properly and that we can solve any problems. This is a critical issue, and we've really got to be getting this right across Europe, because otherwise, one, if you'll excuse my phrase, cock up by somebody in the industry in Europe affects all of us. And why does it affect all of us? Because we're all having to undertake this under a social license to operate. This is a symbolic concept, it's not a signed paper, but it's necessary for operations to gain the support of society. It's necessary for us as an industry to dismiss some of the myths out there and actually win the arguments, because otherwise, without this, we are facing more Balkan type situations. Piece of free advice: if you're going to drill in the UK and you're going to undertake an operation that can have fracking headlines attached to it, please do not drill or start your operations in the middle of the festival season. Please, and particularly near somewhere where there's been a load of road protesters just kicked off a highway development. Please think about it. Set your site up in the summer, but start drilling on a wet Tuesday in February, preferably at about -10. I just think it would do the industry so much good. And there are a lot of risks in this business. We even made it into private eye. Mind you, what I quite like is that they got the fact that we're a respected employee-owned global company providing consultancy, design and construction services in earth, environmental and related areas of energy. They got that off our website, but that is the end of my Golder plug. But if it's in private eye, it must be true. Thank you very much.